Somewhere in South Carolina's coastal regions, buried within plantation ledgers few historians have examined, exists a record contradicting everything we believe about the antebellum South. 52 deaths, each attributed to one man, each recorded with clinical precision in handwriting that never wavered, never showed remorse. The entry spans 7 years, and every single one concludes with the same notation: body disposed of in accordance with standard procedure. What makes these deaths extraordinary isn't merely their number. It's that they were legal, witnessed by hundreds, and celebrated by some of the state's wealthiest families. For over a century, descendants of those families have kept these records concealed. And the reasons why might be more disturbing than the deaths themselves. Before we continue with the story of the man they called the Reaper of the Pines, ensure you're subscribed to this channel, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're watching from. You're about to hear something never meant to leave the archives. The truth concerning what happened in those makeshift fighting pits didn't stay buried by accident. It was carefully orchestrated, deliberately obscured, and, when necessary, violently suppressed. The year was 1847, and Charleston was experiencing what its newspapers termed unprecedented prosperity. Cotton prices had reached heights that made plantation owners feel invincible, and with that wealth came appetites polite society pretended not to notice. The city's elite gathered in parlors decorated with French wallpaper and English furniture, sipping imported brandy while discussing their latest acquisitions: land, slaves, and increasingly, entertainment that couldn't be mentioned in mixed company. 20 miles inland, where the Ashley River curved through endless cotton fields, stood the Hartwell plantation. 3,000 acres worked by nearly 200 enslaved people. It represented the pinnacle of what the planter class called civilization. The main house, a Greek Revival structure with columns gleaming white in the Carolina sun, overlooked grounds manicured to resemble an English estate. Visitors often commented on the beauty, the order, the apparent tranquility. They never saw what occurred in the pines beyond the tobacco barns. Marcus Hartwell had inherited the plantation from his father at age 28, and with it came debts threatening everything his family had built over 3 generations. The old man had been a poor businessman, generous with credit, weak with discipline. Marcus was neither of those things. Within 6 months of taking control, he dismissed the overseer his father had employed for 15 years and brought in someone who understood that profit came from pushing boundaries more squeamish men avoided. The new overseer was a man named Josiah Cruz, and he arrived with a reputation. He'd worked plantations in Mississippi, where production numbers consistently exceeded all projections, where slave mortality rates were high, but so were profits. He possessed cold gray eyes and a way of looking at people, all people, regardless of color, that made it clear he saw them as mechanisms to be optimized or discarded. It was Cruz who first suggested the fights. He presented it to Hartwell one August evening after the books had been reviewed and the numbers weren't improving fast enough. They were in the plantation office, a room smelling of leather and tobacco, when Cruz laid out his proposal with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing crop rotation. "There's money in entertainment," Cruz said, pouring himself whiskey without asking. The rice planters near Savannah have been doing it for years. Private affairs, gentlemen's sport, they call it. $50 a seat, sometimes more. And it solves another problem. Hartwell had looked up from his ledgers. What problem? The troublesome ones. Every plantation's got them. Men too proud, too strong, too likely to cause problems. You work them to death slowly, or you make them useful. Cruz had smiled then, showing teeth yellowed by chewing tobacco. And profitable. The idea wasn't entirely new to the region. Slave fights had occurred in various forms across the South for decades: informal contests, weekend entertainment, ways for plantation owners to settle disputes or simply pass time. But what Cruz proposed was different in scale and ambition. He wanted to create something systematic, something generating consistent revenue, something attracting paying spectators from across the state. Hartwell spent 3 days considering the proposal. He consulted his account books, calculated potential revenue, weighed risks against rewards. His father's debts amounted to nearly $18,000, accumulated over years of poor crops and poorer management. The plantation produced enough to sustain itself, but not enough to pay down that mountain of obligation. At the current rate, Marcus would spend the next 15 years just breaking even, never building wealth, never achieving the status his family name should command. The fights offered a different path. High risk, certainly, but also high reward, and Marcus Hartwell had not inherited his father's aversion to risk. On August 23, 1847, he gave Cruz permission to proceed. The first fight took place in September in a clearing 300 yards into the pine forest. They'd built a simple ring, ropes strung between posts driven deep into the sandy soil, crude wooden benches arranged in a circle, torches for light. 23 men attended that first night. Planters from neighboring estates, merchants from Charleston with appetites for violence they couldn't satisfy in the city's structured society. The fighters were two men marked as discipline problems. One had talked back to an overseer. The other had been caught trying to learn to read. The rules were simple. Fight until one man couldn't continue. No weapons, no mercy. The winner would receive an extra ration of meat each week for a month. The loser would be sold downriver to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. The fight lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, one man was unconscious, his jaw broken so severely he'd never speak clearly again. The other stood in the ring center, his knuckles split and bleeding, his eyes empty of everything except the will to survive. His name was registered in the plantation books as property number 127, but the other slaves called him Solomon. He was 22 years old, stood 6 feet and 3 inches tall, and weighed 190 pounds of muscle, built from 14 years of field work. He'd been born on the Hartwell plantation, son of a woman who died in childbirth 3 years after his birth. He'd grown up knowing nothing but cotton and punishment, his world bounded by the river on one side and the pine forest on the other. Solomon had not been marked as a discipline problem. He'd never caused trouble, never resisted orders, never given the overseers reason to single him out. But he was strong, unusually so, and Cruz had noticed that strength during his first weeks on the plantation. When the decision was made to hold fights, Solomon's name went on a list of potential fighters, men whose physical capabilities made them valuable for this new enterprise. After that first fight, something changed in Solomon's eyes. Those who'd known him before would later say it was like watching a man die while his body kept moving. He didn't celebrate his victory. He didn't eat the extra meat he'd won. He simply returned to the slave quarters and lay on his wooden bunk, staring at the ceiling until dawn. But Marcus Hartwell had seen something else in that ring. He'd seen 23 men place bets totaling over $400. He'd seen their excitement, their bloodlust, their willingness to pay for something they couldn't find anywhere else. He'd seen a solution to his financial problems. The spectators talked about the fight for days afterward. They gathered in Charleston parlors and plantation offices, discussing what they'd witnessed with the excited energy of men who discovered something new and forbidden. Word spread through whisper networks, careful, coded conversations never using explicit language but conveying clear meaning. By October, Hartwell was receiving inquiries from men he'd never met, wealthy planters from Georgia and North Carolina wanting to know if the rumors were true, if there would be more events, if they could purchase seats. Within a month, Cruz had transformed the clearing. The rope ring became a proper fighting pit dug 2 feet into the ground with wooden walls rising another 3 feet. The Earth's depression served multiple purposes. It gave spectators better sight lines, contained the violence within a defined space, and made it harder for fighters to escape. Proper seating was constructed, arranged in tiers so every spectator had a clear view. A small building went up nearby, part storage, part preparation room, part holding cell for the fighters. The construction took 3 weeks and cost nearly $200 in materials and labor. Hartwell paid it without hesitation. He could see the investment would pay for itself within months, perhaps weeks. Invitations for the second fight went out in mid-October, printed on expensive paper, delivered by trusted slaves. They promised an evening of entertainment unlike any available in Charleston and requested the discretion of all recipients. The price per seat had increased to $75. Every seat sold out within 4 days. Solomon fought again on October 28 against a man from a neighboring plantation who'd killed an overseer with a shovel. The crowd was larger this time, 37 men, including a state legislator and 2 judges. The presence of such prominent citizens gave the event a veneer of legitimacy, an unspoken endorsement that what was happening here fell within acceptable behavior for men of their class. The fight was faster than the first, more brutal. Solomon had learned something in that initial contest, learned how to be efficient with violence, how to identify weakness and exploit it immediately. The fight lasted 6 minutes and left his opponent broken on the pit's floor, breathing but unconscious, his ribs fractured in multiple places. The crowd loved it. Bets had totaled over $800, and the winners collected their money with satisfied grins. Several spectators approached Hartwell after the fight, congratulating him on the entertainment, asking when the next event would be scheduled, offering to bring friends who would pay premium prices. By November, Solomon had fought 4 times. By December, 6. Each fight brought more spectators, higher stakes, bigger bets. The pit that had started as an experiment was becoming an institution, a regular fixture in the social calendar of South Carolina's wealthy elite. Hartwell commissioned a proper ledger dedicated solely to recording the events, dates, fighters, outcomes, revenue. He hired a clerk from Charleston, a thin man with neat handwriting and no apparent moral qualms, to maintain the records. The entries were clinical, businesslike, stripping all humanity from what they documented. Each fight became a transaction, a line item in an accounting of violence. The entries from that first year paint a picture surviving documents can barely convey. Each fight was recorded with surgical precision. December 14, 1847. Property number 127 versus property on loan from Middleton Estate. Duration, 8 minutes. Result, visiting property deceased. Cause, trauma to head and chest. Revenue, $2,240. Expenses, $180. Net, $2,060. The word deceased appeared more frequently as the months progressed. Solomon never lost. More disturbing, he never seemed to try to avoid killing his opponents. There was no showmanship in his fighting, no unnecessary cruelty, but also no mercy. He fought with a methodical efficiency spectators found both thrilling and unsettling. He studied each opponent for weaknesses, then exploited them with devastating precision. Some fights ended quickly, others took longer, but they all ended the same way. By the spring of 1848, Solomon had killed 7 men in the ring. The plantation's financial situation had completely reversed. Hartwell had paid off his father's debts and had begun expanding his operations. He'd purchased 2 adjoining properties and 70 additional slaves. The fights were now monthly events scheduled around the agricultural calendar, advertised through whisper networks reaching as far as Virginia. The Hartwell plantation's transformation was remarkable to witness. What had been a struggling estate teetering on bankruptcy had become one of the Low Country's most profitable operations. Hartwell's social standing rose accordingly. He was invited to dinners he'd never have attended before, included in business ventures with men who'd previously ignored him, treated with the deference accorded to successful men. And all of it was built on blood spilled in a pit in the pines. But something was happening to Solomon that Cruz noticed before anyone else. The man was changing, and not just emotionally. His body was adapting to the violence in ways that seemed almost impossible. His hands, constantly broken and rebroken, had developed calluses thick as shoe leather. His pain tolerance had increased to where blows that should have staggered him barely registered. His reflexes had sharpened to levels that made Cruz, who'd seen hundreds of fights across multiple states, genuinely uneasy. "He's becoming something else," Cruz told Hartwell one night after a particularly brutal fight. They were in the plantation office counting the evening's revenue. The others are afraid of him. Not just the fighters, all of them. They won't look at him. Won't speak to him. Hartwell had laughed, drunk on whiskey and profit. Fear is useful. Keeps them in line. This isn't that kind of fear, Cruz insisted. This is the fear you see before a rebellion. They think he's cursed. Or blessed. They're not sure which, and that makes them dangerous. But Hartwell wouldn't listen. The money was too good, the reputation too valuable. By summer, people were traveling from 3 states away to watch Solomon fight. The pit had been expanded again, the seating increased to accommodate over 100 spectators. The price per seat had risen to $100, and still every event sold out within days of announcement. The fight's social dynamics had evolved into something complex and revealing. The spectators weren't just coming for violence. They were coming for community, for the shared experience of witnessing something forbidden. Friendships formed in those torchlit clearings. Business deals were negotiated between fights. Political alliances were forged while watching men destroy each other for entertainment. The fights had become a shadow institution, operating parallel to Charleston's official social structures but never acknowledged in polite conversation. A man might see his banker, his lawyer, and his minister all seated around the same pit, but none would ever mention it at church on Sunday. The ledger entries continued their grim march. 10 deaths, 15, 20. Each recorded with the same clinical detachment, the same neat handwriting, the same notation, body disposed of in accordance with standard procedure. No one asked what that procedure was. No one wanted to know where the bodies went or how they disappeared so completely that not even rumors emerged. The spectators came for blood sport, not moral complications. They placed their bets, watched men destroy each other, collected their winnings, and returned to their lives, pretending what they'd witnessed was somehow civilized because it happened by rules they'd all agreed upon. The slaves on the Hartwell plantation knew where the bodies went. There was a ravine 3 miles into the pine forest, deep enough that nothing thrown into it was ever seen again. The bodies went there in the hours before dawn, wrapped in canvas, carried by men ordered to forget what they'd done by sunrise. Solomon was 23 years old and had killed 20 men with his bare hands when something unexpected happened. He started winning too quickly. The fights that had once lasted anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes were now ending in 3, sometimes 2 minutes. Opponents trained specifically to fight him would enter the pit with strategy and determination and be carried out unconscious or dead before the crowd finished placing all their bets. The entertainment value was declining. Spectators wanted struggle, wanted drama, wanted to feel their money's worth. Men were paying $100 for 4 minutes of violence. They wanted more. Cruz proposed a solution. Add weapons. Not knives or guns, nothing making it quick, but improvised tools. Things found on any plantation. Farming implements, chains, pieces of wood, anything extending the fights, increasing the spectacle, giving opponents a theoretical chance. Hartwell agreed. The ledger entry for August 1848 notes the change. New conditions implemented to increase entertainment value and duration of contests. Combatants may be provided with agricultural implements or restraint tools at management's discretion. Property number 127 to remain unarmed to maintain competitive balance. Announcing the new rules generated immediate excitement among the regular spectators. The idea of watching Solomon fight armed opponents with just his bare hands added a layer of danger and drama that had been missing. Bets increased. Attendance swelled. The price per seat jumped to $125. Solomon's first fight under the new rules came on a Tuesday night when humidity hung in the air thick enough to choke on. His opponent was armed with a cotton hook, a tool used for pulling bolls from the plants, about 3 feet long with a wicked curved blade at one end. The man wielding it was experienced, had been trained for weeks specifically for this fight, understood how to use the weapon's reach to his advantage. Solomon had his bare hands. The fight lasted 7 minutes. When it was over, the man with the cotton hook was dead, and Solomon stood in the pit center, holding the weapon he'd taken from his opponent's broken grip. He stared at it for a long moment, his chest heaving, blood running down his arms from cuts where the blade had caught him before he'd closed the distance. Then he dropped the hook in the dirt and walked back to his corner without expression. The crowd loved it. The tension had been excruciating, the violence sustained in ways the quick fights hadn't provided. Here was what they'd been missing: genuine uncertainty, real danger, the possibility Solomon might actually lose. Bets for the next fight doubled. Over the following months, opponents came armed with increasingly creative implements: hoe handles, chains with locks attached, pieces of fence rail, pitchforks with the tines wrapped in canvas to extend the fight without making death too quick. Each fight became an exercise in brutality, with Solomon forced to close distance against weapons while his opponents tried to use their advantages before he could reach them. The fights got longer, more violent, more profitable. And Solomon kept winning. By the fall of 1849, he'd been fighting for 2 years. The count stood at 32 confirmed deaths. The ledger recorded them all, along with increasingly impressive revenue numbers. Hartwell had become one of the region's wealthiest planters. He'd built an addition onto the main house, purchased a property in Charleston for the winter season, and begun entertaining political ambitions. The fights had become legendary. Men traveled from as far as Tennessee and Kentucky to witness them. Some came multiple times, bringing different groups of friends, spreading the reputation further. Hartwell received letters requesting special events, offering premium prices for private showings. The whole enterprise had grown beyond anything he'd initially imagined. But cracks were forming in this empire's foundation built on violence. The first appeared in the slave quarters themselves. Solomon's transformation into something barely human had initially generated fear, but that fear was evolving into something more complex. He represented power, brutal and undeniable power existing within a slave's body, even if used for the master's entertainment. And some enslaved people on the Hartwell plantation had begun to wonder what would happen if that power was redirected. There was a woman named Dinah who worked in the main house as a cook. She was 43, had been born on a Virginia plantation, and had watched 3 of her own children sold away before being purchased by the elder Hartwell 15 years prior. She'd known Solomon since he was 10, had given him extra food when she could, had taught him herb names and how to identify which plants were safe to eat from the forest. She'd also watched him transform into something she barely recognized. Dinah understood the ledger in ways the clerk maintaining it never could. She cleaned Hartwell's office twice a week, and though she couldn't read well, just enough to make out prices and quantities for kitchen supplies, she recognized patterns, the regular entries, the neat handwriting, the frequency matching the fight schedule. She understood each line represented a death. And she understood all those deaths bore Solomon's name. But she also understood something else: every fight proved a slave could kill a master's prized property without punishment as long as it happened in that pit. And if Solomon could kill valuable slaves with impunity, what did that say about the rules supposedly governing their world? These thoughts led to conversations, carefully conducted, always where overseers couldn't hear. In the tobacco barns during sorting, in the cotton fields during water breaks, in the slave quarters after the evening bell when darkness provided cover for words that could get them all killed. She found others thinking similar thoughts. A man named Isaac, who worked the stables, had seen the careful preparation going into each fight, the feeding, the training, the medical attention given to fighters before entering the pit. He'd seen how much value the masters placed on these contests. A woman named Ruth, who worked laundry, had washed Solomon's fighting clothes after every match, had seen the blood never fully coming out, had noted the increasing frequency of those particular garments in her washing pile. Together they began piecing together the full scope of what was happening in those pines, the money changing hands, the network of wealthy men traveling from across the South, the systematic nature of the violence, and most importantly, the vulnerability it created. "They gather in one place," Isaac said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. All of them. Their best overseers are watching the pit. The rest of the plantation is practically unguarded. If someone wanted to do something, if people were organized, that would be the time. That's suicide, another man said. His name was Thomas, and he was younger, less patient. They'd hunt us down, kill us all. They're going to kill us anyway, Ruth said quietly. Just slower. Working us to death in these fields, or selling us downriver when we're used up, or putting us in that pit for their entertainment. At least this way, we choose how it happens. The conversations never went beyond speculation. No concrete plans were made, no actions taken. But the fact such talk was happening at all represented a fundamental shift. The fights had done something Hartwell and Cruz never anticipated. They demonstrated the power structure could be challenged, that violence could flow in directions other than master to slave. The second crack appeared among the spectators themselves. Not everyone who attended the fights walked away entertained. Some men, particularly those new to the events, found themselves disturbed by what they'd witnessed. The clinical nature of the violence, the systematic way it was organized, the regular attendees' casual attitude, all combined to create an experience feeling less like sport and more like something darker. A Charleston merchant named Samuel Pinckney attended his first fight in September 1849. He'd been invited by a business associate, told only he'd witness entertainment unlike anything he'd seen before. The price, $125, suggested something exclusive, something extraordinary. What he witnessed was Solomon fighting a man armed with a chain. The fight lasted 9 minutes and ended with the opponent unconscious, his skull fractured, his breathing shallow and irregular. He died 3 hours later, though Pinckney was long gone by then. Pinckney vomited twice on the ride back to Charleston. He never attended another fight, never accepted another invitation, and in letters discovered after his death, he described the experience as witnessing hell organized as a business venture. He wasn't alone. A significant minority of first-time attendees never returned. Some were vocal about their disgust, though never publicly. To do so would mean admitting they'd been there at all. Others simply declined future invitations with polite but firm excuses. But here's what worried Cruz: the rate of new attendees was declining. In the early days, every fight brought fresh faces, men eager to witness what they'd heard about in whispered conversations. By late 1849, the audience had become largely static. The same 100 or so men attending regularly, with few new spectators joining. The enterprise was reaching saturation. There were only so many men in the region wealthy enough to afford the price and morally flexible enough to attend. Once that pool was exhausted, growth would stop, revenue would plateau. And Solomon, who'd already killed 32 men, showed no signs of becoming less efficient. "We need to think about the endgame," Cruz told Hartwell in October. They were reviewing the books, noting that while revenue remained high, it had stopped growing. "This can't continue indefinitely. Eventually, something breaks. Then we find new markets," Hartwell said. "Expand into Georgia, North Carolina. There are wealthy men everywhere with appetites for this kind of entertainment. That brings risks. The more people who know, the more likely someone talks to the wrong person. A journalist, a minister, a politician looking to make a name. Right now, this stays quiet because everyone involved benefits from silence. But the larger it grows, the harder that becomes to maintain. So what do you suggest?" Cruz was quiet for a long moment. "I suggest we've made enough money. We shut it down before it becomes a problem we can't control." Hartwell's laugh was dismissive. "You want to walk away from $50,000 a year? More. You want to waste what we've built. I want to survive. And I'm not sure we can if this continues." But Cruz's warnings fell on deaf ears. Hartwell was addicted to more than just the money. He was addicted to the status, the secret knowledge he'd created something unique, The power of hosting events the South's wealthiest men would travel hundreds of miles to attend. That addiction would prove catastrophic. The real problem, the one neither Hartwell nor Cruz fully understood, was happening inside Solomon himself. For 2 years, he'd existed in a state of mechanical shutdown, doing what was required without thought or feeling. The fights were just another form of labor, brutal but necessary for survival. He'd stopped being a person and become a function, a machine designed to inflict violence efficiently. But machines don't dream, and Solomon had started dreaming again. The dreams were fragments at first, images of his mother, whose face he'd almost forgotten, memories of childhood, of days before the fights when his existence contained something other than violence and waiting. These fragments grew more vivid, more frequent, more impossible to ignore. He began to remember what he'd been, and remembering what he'd been forced him to see what he'd become. The crisis came to a head in late October during a fight that should have been routine. Solomon's opponent was a man from a Georgia plantation, someone with a solid record of victories. The fight began normally. The bell rang. The crowd roared. The opponent advanced with his weapon, a hoe handle held ready. Solomon stood in his corner and didn't move. 5 seconds passed. 10. The crowd's noise began fading as people realized something unexpected was happening. The opponent hesitated, confused by the lack of resistance. Cruz shouted orders from outside the pit. Hartwell stood up from his seat, his face flushing with anger. Then Solomon spoke, his voice rough from disuse but clear enough to carry. "I'm done." The pit went absolutely silent. "Property 127, Hartwell said, his voice shaking with barely held rage. "You will fight. Now." No, that single word, that simple refusal, changed everything. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't defiant. It was just final, a statement of fact. Solomon would not fight. Not today. Not ever again. What happened next unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare. Solomon walked to the pit's wall, gripped the top, and pulled himself out. 3 overseers moved to intercept him. He walked through them like they weren't there, breaking one man's arm and dislocating another's shoulder with casual efficiency, never breaking stride. He walked across the clearing, past the seated spectators scrambling out of his path, through the pine forest, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the torchlight. The crowd sat in stunned silence for perhaps 30 seconds. Then chaos erupted. Some men demanded refunds. Others wanted to know what was being done to apprehend the escapee. A few, drunk enough to speak honestly, admitted they were terrified by what they'd just witnessed, not the violence, but the calm determination with which Solomon had simply walked away from 2 years of conditioning, 2 years of forced obedience, 2 years of being treated as property. He'd reminded everyone present he was something more dangerous than a trained fighter. He was a human being who decided he'd had enough. The manhunt that followed was the largest in South Carolina history up to that point. Cruz assembled every available overseer, hired slave catchers from Charleston, brought in dogs from 3 counties. They tracked Solomon for 2 days through pine forests and cypress swamps, following signs suggesting he was heading toward the coast. The search grew increasingly desperate as hours turned into days. Every plantation in the region was put on alert. Patrols doubled. Curfews were enforced with brutal efficiency. The other slaves on the Hartwell plantation were questioned repeatedly, sometimes violently. But no one admitted knowing anything about Solomon's plans or destination because no one did know. Solomon had told no one what he intended. He'd simply decided in that moment in the pit he would rather die free than live as a weapon. They found him on the 3rd day in a clearing beside an Ashley River tributary. He was sitting on a fallen log, his hands resting on his knees, waiting. He didn't run when they approached. He didn't fight when they surrounded him. He simply stood up and allowed himself to be chained. "Why'd you stop?" one of the slave catchers asked, genuinely curious. "You could have made it to the coast. Could have tried for a ship." tried for freedom. Solomon's response was quiet. This is freedom. Choosing when it ends. They brought him back to the plantation at dawn on March 18, 1850. Every slave had been assembled to witness what would happen next, a lesson in disobedience's consequences. Hartwell stood on the main house's steps, his face rigid with barely held rage. The other slaves watched in silence as Solomon was dragged before Hartwell, still in chains, his clothes torn from days in the forest, but his expression unchanged. He looked at Hartwell with something that might have been pity, might have been contempt, might have been nothing at all. "You will fight again," Hartwell said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Or you will be punished in ways making you beg for death. The choice is yours." Solomon's response was quiet, but it carried across the sudden silence. "Already dead. Been dead since the first one. You just didn't notice." What happened next depended on who told the story later. The official version, the one entered into court records and newspaper accounts, stated that property number 127 attacked Marcus Hartwell on the morning of March 18, 1850, and was shot while attempting to kill his owner. Multiple witnesses supported this version: overseers, other planters, spectators who'd stayed overnight after the aborted fight. The slave had gone mad, they said, broke his chains through inhuman strength, had to be stopped before he murdered everyone present. But before we examine what truly happened in those final moments, we need to understand the hours preceding them. Because the events of March 18th didn't begin at dawn. They began in darkness, in the hours when most people slept, when the only witnesses were those forced to watch. Solomon had been brought back to the plantation just before midnight on March 17th. The slave catchers delivered him directly to Cruz, who ordered him locked in the small building near the fighting pit, the same structure serving as a holding cell for fighters before matches. It was a deliberate choice. Cruz wanted Solomon to spend his final hours where he'd become what he was, surrounded by the ghosts of everything he'd done. The building was 10 by 10 feet with walls of rough-cut pine boards and a single door barred from outside. There were no windows, no light except what leaked through wall cracks. The floor was dirt packed hard by 2 years of fighters pacing before their matches. It smelled of sweat, fear, and old blood seeping between floorboards. Cruz stationed 4 overseers outside with instructions Solomon was not to be given food, water, or rest. The punishment would begin at dawn, but the suffering would start immediately. Psychological torture was often more effective than physical pain, and Cruz wanted Solomon broken before Hartwell even saw him in the morning. But Solomon didn't pace, didn't test the door, didn't show any signs of the panic or desperation Cruz expected. He simply sat in that small room center, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, and waited. When the overseers looked through wall cracks, checking on him throughout the night, they saw the same position. He might have been meditating. He might have been praying. Or he might have simply been existing in a state beyond their understanding, in a place where fear no longer lived because there was nothing left to lose. In the slave quarters 300 yards away, no one slept that night. The word had spread within minutes of Solomon's return. He was back. He was being held. And everyone understood what dawn would bring. Dinah sat on her bunk, her hands clasped, lips moving in silent prayer. Isaac stood outside the quarters, staring toward the pines where that small building stood, wondering if anything could be done, knowing there wasn't. Ruth held her children close, telling them everything would be fine, even though she knew it wouldn't. They all understood they were about to witness something defining the rest of their lives. Some moments fracture reality into before and after, and this would be one of them. At 4 a.m., Cruz began assembling the overseers. Every man working on the plantation was summoned, 12 total, plus the 4 guarding Solomon all night. He wanted overwhelming force. Wanted no possibility of Solomon escaping again. Wanted every slave to see resistance was futile. At 5 o'clock, as the first gray light filtered through pine trees, Hartwell emerged from the main house. He was dressed impeccably, as if heading to church rather than an execution. He'd spent the night composing letters to spectators present for the aborted fight, carefully worded explanations preserving his reputation while acknowledging the enterprise was concluded. The letters would be sent later that day, each assuring the recipient their discretion was appreciated and expected. At 5:30, every enslaved person on the Hartwell plantation was ordered to assemble in the open area between the main house and slave quarters. Nearly 200 people gathered in pre-dawn darkness, standing in family groups, holding children who didn't understand why they'd been woken so early. The overseers formed a perimeter around them, rifles visible and ready. At 6 o'clock, as the sun broke over the horizon, Solomon was brought out. He had to be dragged, not because he resisted, he made no attempt to fight, but because 3 days in the forest, followed by a night without food or water, had weakened him to where walking was difficult. His wrists were shackled, his ankles chained together with just enough slack to shuffle. 4 overseers surrounded him, hands on weapons, watching for any sign of the violence defining his existence for 2 years. But Solomon's eyes were calm, empty of fear, empty of anger, empty of everything except quiet acceptance, making some watching slaves weep openly. Hartwell stood on the main house's steps, elevated above the assembled crowd. He waited until Solomon was positioned in the open area center, clearly visible to everyone present, before he spoke. "This man is property number 127. Hartwell's voice carried across the morning air, cold and formal. "For 2 years he has served profitably. He has been fed well, housed adequately, and treated with the consideration appropriate to valuable property. In return, he was required only to perform assigned tasks. Simple obedience, nothing more." He paused, letting the words settle. Several white spectators who'd stayed overnight stood near the main house, watching with the detached curiosity of men viewing a necessary but unpleasant business transaction. 3 nights ago, this property refused a direct order. He abandoned his post. He fled into the wilderness. These actions cannot be tolerated. Discipline must be maintained. Order must be preserved. Every person here must understand disobedience's consequences. What happened next would be disputed in years following, details changing depending on who told the story. But certain facts remained consistent across all versions. Solomon was tied to a post erected specifically for this purpose. His arms stretched above his head, his feet barely touching ground. The position was designed to be painful even before punishment began, the body's weight pulling on shoulders and wrists, making deep breathing difficult. Crews approached with a whip, not the standard overseer's whip used for field discipline, but something heavier designed for maximum impact. 15 strokes were announced. Each would be counted aloud so everyone present would know exactly what disobedience cost. The first stroke fell at 6:15. The sound of leather hitting flesh carried across the silent gathering like a thunderclap. Solomon made no sound. The second stroke came 30 seconds later. Still no sound. By the 5th stroke, some watching slaves had turned away, unable to witness what was happening. The overseers forced them to turn back, made them watch, ensured the lesson was learned. By the 10th stroke, blood ran down Solomon's back, soaking into his torn pants, dripping onto ground. His body hung limp from the ropes, the only movement the rise and fall of his chest as he struggled to breathe. But he still made no sound, no cry, no plea for mercy. His silence was more disturbing than screaming would have been because it suggested he'd moved beyond pain into some realm where physical suffering couldn't touch him. The 15th stroke fell at 6:45. 30 minutes of systematic brutality, measured and controlled, designed not to kill but to break. When finished, crews stepped back, breathing hard from exertion, and waited for Hartwell's next instruction. "Cut him down," Hartwell ordered. "Let him stand on his own. Let everyone see what happens to those who think they can refuse." 2 overseers cut the ropes. Solomon collapsed immediately, his legs unable to support his weight. He lay in the dirt, blood pooling around him, his chest heaving. The assembled slaves watched in horrified silence. Some children cried. Their parents held them close, whispering it would be over soon, lying because no truth would make this bearable. "Stand up," Hartwell commanded. "Property 127, you will stand." Solomon didn't move. Couldn't move, perhaps. The overseers looked at each other, uncertain. Cruz stepped forward, ready to drag Solomon to his feet, to prop him up if necessary. And then Solomon moved. It took him nearly a minute. His arms, shaking and weak, pushed against ground. His legs, barely functional, slowly straightened. His back, torn and bleeding, bent as he rose. The effort was visible, excruciating, impossible. But he did it. He stood, and when finally upright, swaying but standing, he raised his head and looked directly at Marcus Hartwell. The expression on Solomon's face in that moment would be remembered by everyone who saw it. It wasn't hatred, though hatred would have been understandable. It wasn't defiance, though defiance was what Hartwell had been trying to break. It was something else, something looking almost like pity. "You still don't understand," Solomon said, his voice rough but clear enough to carry. "You can't break something already broken. You can't kill something that died 2 years ago. You think this?" He gestured weakly at his ruined back. "This hurts worse than what you made me do in that pit." "Silence," Hartwell commanded, his voice sharp. "You will be silent." 36 men, Solomon continued as if Hartwell hadn't spoken. "I killed 36 men with these hands. You made me do it. Paid men to watch me do it. Bet money on how fast I could do it. And you think whipping me is punishment? You think this matters?" He took a step forward, just one step, slow and unsteady, but toward Hartwell rather than away. The overseers tensed, hands moving to weapons. The assembled slaves held their breath. "The only choice you left me was how I died," Solomon said. "Fighting in your pit, killing for your entertainment until someone finally killed me. Or refusing. Choosing. Taking back the one thing you couldn't buy or sell or control." He took another step. His legs shook. His body failed. But he moved forward with the determination of a man who decided something and wouldn't be deterred. "So go ahead," Solomon said. "Finish it. Because I'm not your property anymore. Haven't been since I said no. You can kill me, but you can't own me. Not ever again." That was when the shooting started. The official version claimed Solomon lunged at Hartwell, that his intent to kill was obvious, that the overseers acted defending their employer's life. Court documents later stated property number 127 had broken free of restraints, technically true since he'd been cut down from the post, and posed an immediate threat to multiple individuals. But the people there, who watched it happen, told a different story. They said Solomon took 6 steps total, slow steps, painful steps, each requiring visible effort. They said he never raised his hands, never showed any sign of attacking. They said he was simply walking, making a point, demonstrating he could still choose his own path, even if that path led to death. They said the first shot hit him in the chest but didn't stop him. The second caught his shoulder, spinning him partially around but not dropping him. The third, fourth, and fifth struck in rapid succession. And finally, his legs gave out and he fell to his knees, but he didn't fall forward. Even then, even shot 5 times, he stayed upright on his knees, his head raised, his eyes fixed on Hartwell. The 6th shot came from Hartwell himself, who'd drawn a pistol from inside his coat. It struck Solomon in the chest directly over his heart. The impact knocked him backward, and he fell into dirt already stained with his blood. The silence following lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then someone screamed, one of the enslaved women, a sound of pure anguish shattering the frozen moment. Children cried. Men who'd stood silent through the whipping turned away, unable to watch any more. Cruz approached Solomon's body carefully, pistol drawn, ready for any sign of continued threat. but there was none. Solomon lay on his back, his eyes open but empty, his chest still, his battle finally finished. "Get everyone back to work," Hartwell said, his voice shaking despite his attempt at control. "This matter is concluded. Anyone who speaks of it will join him." But the threat was empty, and everyone knew it. You can't threaten silence from 200 witnesses. You can't erase what they've seen. You can't make them forget what you made them watch. The paperwork was filed within days. The case closed within weeks. Property number 127 had been lawfully destroyed while posing an immediate threat to life. No investigation was warranted. No questions raised. The official record was clean, clinical, final. But the unofficial record, the one mattering to the people who'd been there, was just beginning. The ledger entry for March 18, 1850, differs from all others. The handwriting is the same, still neat, still clinical, but the entry is brief. Property 127 deceased. Burial immediate. Revenue from evening event, $0. Security expenses, $340. Total fights, 36. Total deaths attributed, 52, including subject. Final notation, Enterprise concluded. That final notation, Enterprise concluded, represented more than just the fighting pit's end. It marked the end of Hartwell's expansion, his social climbing, the fortune he'd been building on blood and brutality. The fighting pit was filled in that same day. Crews supervised the work personally, watching as slaves shoveled dirt into the depression, covered the wooden walls, erased the physical evidence of what happened there. The seating was dismantled by week's end. The small building where fighters had been held was torn down and burned. By April, nothing remained in that clearing except disturbed earth and tree stumps. But physical evidence was just one problem. The bigger problem was the witnesses. 200 enslaved people had watched Solomon die. They'd heard his final words. They'd seen his refusal to be broken. And within days, the story spread to neighboring plantations, carried by slaves having contact during Sunday gatherings, by workers loaned out for projects, by the invisible communication network existing beneath the master's awareness. Within a month, the story reached plantations 50 miles away. Within 3 months, it crossed state lines. Details changed slightly with each telling. Some versions had Solomon taking 8 steps instead of 6. Others claimed he'd smiled before the final shot. But the core remained consistent. A slave had refused to fight, had chosen death over compliance, and had done so with a dignity shaking everyone who witnessed it. Hartwell felt the change immediately, though he couldn't articulate what had shifted. The slaves on his plantation worked as always, followed orders, showed no overt rebellion signs, but something in the atmosphere had transformed. The fear keeping them compliant before had been replaced by something else, not quite defiance, not quite hope, but an awareness they were human beings capable of choice, even when choices led to terrible consequences. Small resistance acts increased. Nothing dramatic enough to punish severely, but enough to notice. Tools took longer to be found. Tasks took slightly more time to complete. Orders were followed to the letter but without the efficiency or eagerness characterizing work before. It was as if the entire enslaved population had decided collectively and silently to do exactly what was required and not one bit more. Production numbers dropped 8% the first month after Solomon's death, 12% by the second month. Hartwell brought in additional overseers, increased surveillance, implemented harsher discipline policies. The numbers stabilized but never recovered to previous levels. More significantly, escaped slaves from the Hartwell plantation increased dramatically. 3 fled in April, an unprecedented number for a single month, 2 in May, 4 in June. Not all made it to freedom. Several were caught and returned. But the attempts themselves represented a fundamental shift in thinking. Solomon's choice had shown them resistance was possible, even if the price was high. Spectators present for that final aborted fight spread their own version of events. In Charleston parlors and plantation offices, they discussed what they'd witnessed with the nervous energy of men who'd seen something challenging their worldview. Some insisted Solomon had been insane, that his behavior proved strict discipline and control's necessity. Others were less certain, troubled by memories they couldn't shake. Samuel Pinckney, the merchant who'd attended his first fight in September, wrote a friend in Boston 3 weeks after Solomon's death. The letter, discovered decades later in a private collection, was remarkably frank. "I cannot reconcile what I witnessed. The men they killed was property under the law. Yet he displayed more dignity in death than most free men show in life. I paid to watch human beings destroy each other for entertainment, and I called it sport. God help me. I thought myself civilized while participating in barbarism. I do not know what this makes me. But I know I cannot continue as I was." Pinckney wasn't alone in his crisis of conscience. At least 6 men regularly attending fights became involved in anti-slavery activities in subsequent years. Not all became full abolitionists. Some simply stopped participating in slavery's more brutal aspects, treating their slaves with slightly more humanity, allowing small freedoms previously denied. But the doubt seed had been planted, and in some cases grew into genuine moral transformation. 2 of those men wrote memoirs in later years. Neither mentioned the fights explicitly or named the Hartwell plantation, but both included passages clearly referencing what they'd witnessed. Judge William Thornton, who'd attended over 30 fights, wrote, "I witnessed entertainment revealing human cruelty's depths and my own moral bankruptcy. I watched a system destroy a man completely, then punish him for refusing to remain destroyed. The memory haunts me still." Jonathan Graves, a Georgia plantation owner traveling to South Carolina multiple times specifically to attend fights, was more direct in his private journal. "We created a monster, not the fighter, but ourselves. We organized cruelty for profit and pleasure. We gathered in secret to watch men kill each other. And we convinced ourselves it was acceptable because they were property. But property does not look you in the eye and choose death over obedience. Property does not expose the lie at slavery's heart, that human beings can be reduced to things. I carry 36 deaths' weight I paid to witness. I cannot unburden myself of that weight, nor should I be able to." The financial impact on the Hartwell plantation was severe and permanent. The fights generated approximately $50,000 yearly at their peak, equivalent to more than the plantation's cotton production. That income vanished overnight, leaving Hartwell with operating costs calculated for a much larger revenue stream. Within a year, he was forced to sell one property purchased during profitable years. Within 2 years, he sold another. The additional 70 slaves bought were gradually sold off, covering expenses and debts. By 1852, the Hartwell plantation had contracted back to roughly the size when Marcus first inherited it, though now weighted with new debts accumulated during expansion. Hartwell never fully recovered financially. He maintained appearances, lived in the main house, continued presenting himself as a successful planter. But the wealth and status achieved through fights slipped away gradually, like water through cupped hands. He died in 1880 with an estate valued at 60% of what his father left him 33 years earlier. But financial consequences were minor compared to the psychological toll. Those knowing Hartwell in later years described a man transformed by something he refused to discuss. He became isolated, paranoid, prone to anger fits followed by long silences. He increased plantation security to absurd levels, guards posted at night when there was no threat, weapons stored in every building, constant slave quarter patrols. He was afraid. Whether he feared revenge from enslaved people on his plantation or judgment from some higher power, no one could say, but the fear was visible, undeniable, and consumed him. His 1880 Charleston newspaper obituary mentioned neither the fights nor the men making them profitable. It described him as a planter of moderate success serving his community with dedication and noted his brief state legislature service. The obituary was short, generic, forgettable, exactly what his descendants wanted. Solomon's body's fate became one of the story's central mysteries. The official record stated only burial immediate with no location or method details. No grave was ever identified on plantation property. No marker placed. For over a century, the assumption was Solomon had been buried in the ravine where other bodies were disposed of, thrown into that deep earth cut where nothing was ever recovered. But oral histories preserved in the slave community told a different story. According to these accounts, Dinah and several others retrieved Solomon's body that night after overseers left their posts, while Hartwell was locked in his office drinking himself unconscious. They washed blood from his skin, wrapped him in clean cloth, and buried him in a location known only to themselves, somewhere in the pine forest far from the fighting pit, where his spirit could rest without being haunted by what he'd been forced to do. The oral history said they marked the spot with a cairn of river stones and that slaves from the Hartwell plantation visited it regularly for years afterward, leaving small offerings, speaking prayers, maintaining connection to the men who'd shown them choices existed even in the most constrained circumstances. Whether this story was true couldn't be verified. No cairn was ever officially discovered, though that proves nothing. South Carolina's pine forests are vast, and a small stone pile could remain hidden indefinitely. But true or not, the story served an important purpose. It gave Solomon's death meaning beyond what Hartwell intended, transformed him from a disobedience cautionary tale into a resistance and dignity symbol. The ledger itself survived through institutional neglect and family pride combination. Marcus Hartwell couldn't bring himself to destroy it, despite knowing it was evidence of activities becoming less socially acceptable even in the South. The ledger represented his success, his wealth, his brief status and power period. Destroying it would mean admitting all that had been built on something shameful. So he kept it locked in a trunk with other plantation documents. His son inherited it and kept it for the same reasons. His grandson kept it. Each generation aware of what it represented, none willing to destroy evidence of the family's wealth and status, all hoping it would simply be forgotten in some dusty archive where no one would ever look. But documents don't forget. And in 1973, a graduate student named Patricia Hughes researched plantation economics at a South Carolina university when she discovered a trunk of Hartwell family papers donated years earlier but never properly cataloged. Most documents were routine crop records, bills of sale, correspondence about mundane business matters. Then she found the ledger. It took her 3 hours reading before she fully understood what she was looking at. The clinical language, the careful death notations, the revenue calculations, all painted a picture of systematic violence organized for profit. But what struck her most forcefully were the later entries margins where someone, presumably Marcus Hartwell, had made notes revealing growing anxiety, attendance declining, security concerns increasing, property number 127, potential risk. The entry stopped abruptly on March 18, 1850, with that final notation, enterprise concluded. Hughes published her findings in a 1974 historical journal. The article, Blood, Sport and Slavery, Evidence of Organized Fighting Pits in Antebellum South Carolina, created immediate controversy. Some historians questioned the ledger's authenticity, though subsequent analysis confirmed it genuine. Others argued about how representative the Hartwell plantation was. Was this an isolated case or part of a broader pattern? The debate prompted other researchers examining plantation records sitting in archives for decades more carefully. They found additional evidence, not many ledgers as complete as Hartwell's, but fragmentary references to fights, to injuries and deaths attributed to training accidents or disputes among property, to revenue from unspecified entertainment expenses. A pattern emerged: fighting pits existed at multiple plantations across at least 4 states. The practice was never widespread. Most plantation owners had moral objections or feared risks, but common enough the Hartwell case wasn't unique. Dozens of pits operated at various times between 1830 and 1860. Hundreds of enslaved men were forced to fight. The death toll, when researchers tried calculating, ran into 4 figures minimum. The discovery triggered debates continuing today. Museums struggled presenting this information. Should the violence be displayed explicitly showing slavery's full horror, or presented more circumspectly avoiding traumatizing visitors? Historical sites grappled acknowledging fighting pits existing on their properties, knowing such admissions would complicate narratives and potentially alienate donors. Some enslaved people's descendants saw revelations as validation, proof oral histories their families maintained for generations were accurate, that stories of systematic cruelty beyond normal plantation brutality were real. Others felt the spectacular violence focus obscured slavery's everyday horror, making fights seem the worst aspect when the entire system was violence. The Hartwell plantation itself no longer exists as a working farm. The land was sold and subdivided in the 1920s. The main house still stands, privately owned, not open to the public. Fields where cotton once grew are now pine forests managed for timber. The fighting pit's location is unmarked and difficult identifying. The landscape has changed too much over 170 years. But the clearing is still there if you know where to look. The earth where violence was commodified, where 52 men died for entertainment, where Solomon made his final choice, that earth remains covered now by pine needles and underbrush, indistinguishable from any other forest part except in memory. In 2012, a group of Hartwell plantation enslaved people's descendants held a private ceremony in those woods. They didn't know the pit's exact location, but knew the general area. They gathered there, about 30 people ranging from children to elderly, and spoke the names of men dying in that pit. They didn't know all 52 names, most were lost to history, but knew some preserved in family stories, and spoke those names aloud. When they reached Solomon's name, one elderly woman began singing. Others joined her. The song was old, dating back to slavery times, about freedom and choices and dignity's price paid. The words echoed through those pines, through same trees witnessing everything happening there over a century before. No one recorded the ceremony. No news outlets covered it. It wasn't a public event or political statement. It was simply descendants acknowledging ancestors, memories honoring the dead, the past receiving its due in the present. This is what fighting pits left behind, not just ledgers and court records and historical debates, but living memory carried through generations. Trauma and resistance intertwined. Stories refusing to disappear no matter how many people tried burying them. Solomon's story endures not because unique, but because documented. The ledger recording his fights, his kills, his final refusal, that record is rare. Most fighting pits left no trace except oral histories academic historians dismissed for decades lacking written corroboration. But documentation absence isn't truth absence. The fighting pits existed. The men dying in them were real. The spectators paying to watch were prominent citizens whose names still appear on buildings and streets across the South. The wealth generated by that violence was inherited by families whose descendants live comfortably today, often unaware how their privilege was purchased. This isn't ancient history. Patricia Hughes, the researcher discovering the Hartwell ledger, is still alive, still researching plantation economics. Some spectators' descendants still live, though few willing discussing ancestors' involvement. The great-great-grandchildren of enslaved people witnessing Solomon's death walk around today. Many carry stories passed down through families, stories finally recognized as historical evidence rather than dismissed as folklore. The past is never as past as we'd like believing. It lives in documents stored in archives. It lives in stories told around dinner tables. It lives in wealth accumulated and inherited. It lives in trauma passed down through generations. It lives in landscapes seeming peaceful but carrying violence in their soil. And sometimes, when we're willing looking closely enough, willing reading records people tried hiding, willing listening to stories people tried silencing, the past reveals itself in ways changing our understanding of everything we thought we knew. What do you think of this story? The way a man could be transformed into a weapon through violence, used until he broke, then erased from history as if never existing. Do you believe everything was revealed about what happened in those pines, or think secrets remain buried in South Carolina soil? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If you found this tale as disturbing as we did, ensure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell so you never miss our dark history explorations, and share this video with someone appreciating stories refusing to let the past stay buried. Human cruelty's truth doesn't need supernatural elements terrifying.